Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on when and where you're watching us. I'm so glad each of you have tuned in, and I'm glad you're tuning in today for S&G Connections. My name is Jeremy Grandstaff. I'm a strategic planning and collaboration consultant. Our company is S&G Endeavors, and today's episode of S&G Connections is design teams. Let's take a step back just a second to quickly review what S&G Connections is, just to get everybody up to speed. Really, we wanted to create some type of podcast or video cast that gives us the ability here at S&G Endeavors to connect you, our clients, to best practices and knowledge that you need to make your work more effective, to provide an opportunity for you to our clients to be able to talk about successes that you're having in your organization and really what each of your organizations is doing with the work that we have helped you put together, and to help our broader audience understand how S&G Endeavors can help you in really taking your planning and your work in general to the next level. So I'm really glad to be here today for our design team episode. Design teams really are a powerful tool that help our organizations tap into the wisdom of their community and to increase the ability that they have to engage stakeholders in their planning process. And when we talk about engaging stakeholders, the more they're engaged in the planning process, the higher the buy-in is. And so that's where the design team comes into play. I'm actually joined by three I love working with all three of these guys. And we have Elliot Caldwell from Georgia Bikes is with us today. Hey, Elliot, how are you?
Good. Hello, Jeremy. Hello, everybody.
And good to have you joining us from Georgia. Where are you at in Georgia today?
I'm in Athens, Georgia, home of the University of Georgia, and B-52s and REM and all the other great things.
Well, there you go, right? You got to have that personal connection there. We also have David Favre, who's the executive director of Bike Easy, and joining us today from New Orleans. How's New Orleans doing today?
Oh, we're doing great down here. Hot as usual, but feeling good.
That must mean you have a lot of people out biking and walking and
Absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. And then in the northern part of the country, I just realized we've got a little bit of geographic diversity coming to us from a north to south perspective is Jacob VanSickle. Jacob is the executive director for Bike Cleveland. How's Cleveland doing today?
Beautiful. Another great day in Cleveland, Jeremy.
It's always a great day in Cleveland every time we're there. So awesome. Well, these guys have joined us today to talk about their organizations, what they're doing. Each one of them has went through a strategic planning process with us. Jacob is actually in the process of doing number 2. So hats off to Jacob's organization for being at a point where they're ready to come back and set their next course of action. But what really is common among all three of you is how you have used design teams to really tap into the power of the stakeholder groups that you serve, and how you've been able to bring those, their knowledge and their wisdom into the process. Before we actually get into the three of you and the outstanding work that you're doing, I want to just quickly talk about design teams in general for our audience. So when John and I and our staff are working to help our clients go through our process, one of the key steps in our process is called engaging the design team. And really, it's about identifying a diverse group of leaders that are part of the organization and inviting them to be on the design team. The design team is really what I like to think of as the team that gathers data, designs a draft of where we might be heading, and also designs a way for us to engage a larger group of stakeholders in our work. And so when I think about, some of the things that each of you have done with your design team, I know that Bike Cleveland, when you went through this process the first time, you really looked at how the design team could kind of be the core people who were driving the creation of your organization. Now that you're going through Bike Cleveland's second iteration of its strategic plan, 6 years later, you're really kind of tapping into the wisdom of that design team to gather data, and even actually doing some outreach to the community specifically, which will get them more engaged in that third phase of where we go to the community and say this is where we're thinking, and help us create that. And so that's one of the things that stuck out to me when I was thinking about data. I know, Dan, when you guys went through this process at Bike Easy, you really used the design team as a way to build that common ground for your initiatives and what you were working on, to have conversations around, how is equity playing a role in our organization, and what does that look like? Again, something that Bike Cleveland is talking about in greater detail now, and to really kind of use that body of wisdom as a way to think about how you were going to create this summit that engaged New Orleans and the people from New Orleans in your planning process. I know Elliot from Georgia Bikes, when we did your strategic planning, now Georgia Bikes was a little bit different. Georgia Bikes had a virtual approach where their big key piece was a series of meetings that would virtually bring people together from across the state. And I know you guys chose to focus more on a design team that had board and staff and a couple key external stakeholders. And they were really instrumental in thinking about how do we design that larger engagement, and even how do we tap into your bike summit to do that work as well. And so the design team actually came up with that idea of let's also have some type of discussion at the bike summit when we've got people in person, and kind of put a little bit of a touch on that virtual approach. So what is normally the activities of a design team? Well, essentially they're going to engage the design team in what we would probably call more exploratory conversations. So a lot of times we'll see organizations do this with a strategic planning committee. And many times that strategic planning committee is more focused on staff and maybe a couple board members. When we work with our clients, we really want to take that holistic approach. And so we want a design team, and we use that word specifically because they really are designing and executing the process for planning. We want a design team that's really representative of the whole. And we want to be able to engage them in conversations around exploring opportunities that might exist for the organization, for example. We want them to start creating a common picture of what's working and what needs to change. And we want them to be able to collect stakeholder perspectives and relevant data that they need in order to kind of figure out how and what they want to take to a community. So for example, thinking about New Orleans, when we did yours, Dan, one of the things that stuck out to me is we really were able to create this draft plan that we took to the community and what that looked like. And so having that design team gave you the ability to have those outside perspectives in it. And then of course, like I said, their last activity, which is so critical, is to design that engagement experience. And what does that engagement experience look like for your community? Ideally, and I always find it fascinating when we first meet with the design team, I always get the question, well, how many people can we bring to that larger phase? And your guys' organizations have really taken advantage of tapping into the number of people that come into that dialogue. I know, Jacob, when we did yours the first time, we brought 126 people to the table. And I know the design team really was key in creating that event that would catalyze people's interest and get people there. So at S&G, we really want to tap into the power of the design team. I would say it's probably the biggest part of the process. I know a summit seems big, but there's so much planning that actually goes into the summit that the design team really is a key factor to that. So that's a little bit about design teams. I kind of took it back to your organizations. What I kind of want to do as we dive into this a little bit is maybe just kind of keep that screen up, John, that talks about the activities. And let's really dig into this a little bit. And maybe even starting, if it's okay, Dan, with you. First of all, tell us just a little bit about Bike Easy so people know the type of organization that you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bike Easy is the Greater New Orleans bicycle education and advocacy organization. Our mission is to make bicycling easy, safe, and fun for everyone in Greater New Orleans. But really, we, especially in recent years, have been focused on thinking of the bicycle as a tool to improve our region more generally. So how can improved mobility and bicycling impact health equity, impact job access and economic development, impact quality of life, ensure environmental sustainability? And so thinking about how the bicycle really plays a role in our larger systems here in the Greater New Orleans area. So that includes the city of New Orleans, but also our surrounding suburban. We call our counties here parishes still. So in our suburban parishes. And clearly in order to do that, we need a lot of input and a lot of perspectives coming to the table so that we can broadly represent the people riding bikes, the people who would like to be riding bikes more, the people who support improved bicycling and mobility in order to further these other goals of around the economy and public health. And so the design team was really a good way to tap into the wide breadth of knowledge that we really needed to think through how we could be the organization that we were beginning to envision that would have this broader impact while still remaining really focused in our activities and on bicycling. Everything that we do, we really focus on education. So that's from getting into schools with 4th and 5th graders to teaching biking for boomers classes and all across the board. Also teaching people who drive how to ensure that they're keeping other folks safe on the road. We do advocacy work, so working to get more bike lanes on the ground, ensure that the policies out there are actually protecting the people who ride bikes. And then of course we do encouragement as well. So Bike to Work Day, we have a Bike Easy Challenge. We do a bicycle second line here in New Orleans using one of our cultural traditions and incorporating the bicycle. And so thinking about how all those activities can really play into this bigger dynamic and bigger narrative, the design team and the way that we use the design team and building up to our summit, I think was incredibly important to, have all the perspectives to inform it in order to build that common ground and to build stakeholder engagement from a really wide variety of stakeholders and ensure that we are all coming together around this idea of mobility to move us forward into the region that we are all envisioning.
Awesome. Let's pop over to Georgia because I want you to kind of tell us a little bit about Georgia Bikes, Elliot, and maybe some of the things that you remember of how the design team was kind of helpful to you as you guys were going through your process.
Sure. So again, Georgia Bikes, we're the statewide bicycle advocacy organization here. Been around for, I sometimes forget the history, but it's been over 10 years. But as a staffed organization, we're still pretty young in terms of having full-time staff. And so really previous to the sort of the process, working with S&G, we were a sort of one-person executive director-led staff, or one staff only organization, and sort of expanded to include 3 staff sort of right before that process began. So we had a pretty, with one staff person, the board was maybe, a pretty active board, still active, but one staff person in a state as big as Georgia is a big challenge. So I think in terms of the work we did with the design team and S&G, I think a lot of it was focused on not just the changing dynamic in Georgia of bicycles becoming a bigger part of not just cities, but also suburban areas and rural areas, but also the organization needing to sort of reset the goals relative to new staff members, new programs, new work we were doing, and really a bigger, I guess, imprint of the organization within the state. And so that was kind of a big, I think, challenge and a big reason why sort of jumping in with both feet in terms of that process was a good move for us. And sort of setting the bar in terms of what we came out of with a strategic plan to really look forward, not just where we are as an organization, but really where we sort of feel responsible for the state, right? In terms of the local advocates who we partner with, and local clubs and local bicycle businesses and tourism type groups. So we really feel responsible for those, and we want to see them grow along with us. So I feel like that process kind of engaged the nature of the work that we want to be doing and kind of where we want to go in the future.
Awesome. I'm gonna pop over to Jacob real quick. Tell us a little bit about Bike Cleveland. You've kind of been through this twice. So how have design teams impacted what you have done when you've been working with us, and maybe how is this design team different as Jacob's kind of in the middle of their second iteration. So how is it different this time? And then I've got just some general questions that I'll ask each of you. We'll kind of open it up for a roundtable.
Yeah, so Bike Cleveland, similar to Dan, we're kind of the region's bicycle advocacy organization. So we do education programs, lead advocacy campaigns, do encouragement activities, really all about, getting people on bikes, kind of spreading the word that, building a vibrant, healthy, livable community is really about giving people transportation choice. And, that's what our small staff, we have a staff of 3 who does day in and day out. The experience for us with our design teams in the initial founding of Bike Cleveland, which took place back in 2011, our design team was really created from scratch, from a group of kind of community development minded folks that really wanted to see biking be elevated in their neighborhoods and in their communities, who came together to say, what can we do to really mobilize an engaged community to speak up, to get bike lanes and trails and really connect our neighborhoods with active transportation. So we brought folks together, to help kind of develop the initial mission and the vision, and our tactical plan for a brand new organization. We started off with a very active board, with just one staff, being me, hired in 2012, and have kind of grown from there. So fast forward about 6 years later, we've re-engaged with S&G to kind of do a little bit of update. We had accomplished a lot of our goals in our original strategic plan. And we did some internal updates to really still make sure our work is relevant for the community that we serve. But we wanted to kind of bring it back and pull our board and some key volunteers and stakeholders together again, to relook at what we're doing, and how can we assure that the work that we're doing day in and day out can be the most effective and tip the scale to the greatest extent. So this time around, we've engaged obviously our board, some key volunteers and some external stakeholders who are really helping this time around do a lot of data gathering, via obviously survey collection, but we did a host of interviews and focus groups, and utilizing the design team to help kind of analyze the feedback from those various information gathering activities. And in addition to a larger summit, we're also planning to do some very focused neighborhood outreach activities, knowing that, at the summit, we're going to get a lot of our members, and we're going to get a lot of people that understand our work and can give great input. But we really want to be able to engage folks in the neighborhood who might not necessarily understand the work of Bike Cleveland, to get their feedback, to ensure that the work we're doing is not just us going into the neighborhood and pushing our programs, but what we're doing is actually coming from the community, so we can ensure we're engaging the largest diverse audience as we can.
Awesome. And we're going to have time for Q&A from the audience. So if you are watching live and you've got a question, definitely feel free to get that in. I want to just kind of open it up to the 3 of you, and just, if a couple of you can kind of weigh in, and some of the questions that I've been thinking about as I was thinking about some of the work that you did. Each of you really targeted engaging different stakeholder groups on your design team that were kind of important to you. So Dan, give us 2 examples of like when you were thinking about the wholeness of your design team, and I know normally we'll start with board and staff and then look at how do we make it more whole. Who were a couple people that we said, you know what, we really want, I think there was like just maybe a couple that we said, we really want to get this particular group represented.
Yeah, you know, one of the big things that we grapple with here in New Orleans is that we don't actually have a pedestrian or walking advocacy organization or folks that are representing people who walk, making sure, looking out for their safety. So we really thought it was important to ensure that anyone who was engaged in those types of activities be able to come to be a part of our design team and our summit to figure out exactly what role Bike Easy should be playing in protecting people who are walking, as we've kind of been doing it de facto since there was a dearth of it in the region. So we went to, and then another piece that we were really looking, as you mentioned earlier, Jeremy, was figuring out how we incorporate equity into our work. And so one of the organizations that we had a relationship with, but we really wanted to make sure that they had really strong input, is a group called Girl Trek, which is an African-American women's public health organization that they really just get out there and get women together to walk. And they're starting to think a little bit more about the advocacy roles they could play. And so we clearly wanted them to be in the conversation so we could think about, you know, ensure that that sort of walking perspective was on the ground, it was part of the summit. Another one, and this is more of, we wanted to just ensure that there were the right folks from public health, the public health sector writ large, because we really are approaching a lot of our work through a health equity lens. And so, you know, with Girl Trek, it's sort of the ladies on the ground who are moving and understanding what the streets are like in that sense. And then, you know, we had partners from Louisiana Public Health Institute that came to the summit. There was a few others as well that really could bring that sort of larger public health lens and how we use the data and sort of more technical aspects to ensure that as we're making it better for people to bike and walk, that we are ensuring that that is giving people the opportunity to have a physical activity that will lead them to be healthier.
What about you guys, Elliot? You had a whole state to deal with. I remember your design team, we did start with board and staff, but do you remember any of the key external groups that we invited that weren't board and staff?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, our history in terms of being a funded organization with staff, with an ED, really sort of started out through bicycle education. Oddly enough, it's actually not an area that I have much of a background in. I'm not an LCI. Nothing against that. It's just not where I sort of come out of. So, but we have a staff person now that focuses on education. And Brent Weiss, the previous executive director, he was an LCI, and the initial funding was through education sort of work. And so I know that within the design team, we definitely were, you know, we wanted to have folks that had at least some background in terms of bicycle education, knowing that that's partly what we came out of. But similar into what Dan was talking about, you know, I know we try to engage some folks that were coming more from public health and coming, you know, less from the the bike education sector and more just the broader sort of advocacy and policy sort of area, because those are areas that we're sort of more funded in now. Not that we're not doing bike education, but in a lot of ways, I think that a lot of bike education has been more dispersed versus, again, maybe 5 or 10 years ago where it was a little bit more centralized. There are bike education efforts going on in our state that are not necessarily led directly by LCIs or happening more in a neighborhood context or community organization context, mainly in Atlanta, but other places too. And so I think when we were looking at who we want to engage with, knowing that, you know, I would say, and I don't want to speak for the rest of the South, but I would say in Georgia, we're a little bit behind in making that connection between sort of public health and sort of biking and walking and sort of activities like that, contributing to sort of positive public health outcomes and the consequences of not having health equity and not, you know, low income people and people of color not having access to safe places to bike and walk. I think we're a little bit behind a lot of the rest of the country. So I know getting more folks that are sort of health equity minded and public health oriented was a priority maybe for some of the folks on that call, but certainly moving forward in any kind of work we do, I think that's really where we're at, considering we're the home of the CDC, we're the home of other sort of big institutions that are involved in this work. But it's difficult sometimes to get that down to the local level in a place like Tifton or Augusta or places like that.
So Jacob, weigh in for us on yours, stakeholders that we haven't that you guys have really worked at engaging on your design team?
Yeah, so in our first design team during the founding of Bike Cleveland, we were really intentional to make sure, similar to what Dan and Elliot said, is making sure we engage kind of public health folks. So we engaged, folks from the local hospital systems here. One of the groups that we did engage that they didn't mention is folks from the business community, not just from local bike shops, but large employers that could benefit from employees that are biking more often. We were trying to be as inclusive as we could in our design team. If I recall correctly, I believe our design team in our first iteration was about 30 people that we had brought together to help kind of develop what our organization would look like. In the current iteration, which we're going through now, it's primarily board and staff, but we were intentional in making sure we engaged some of our long-term members, as well as a few of our larger funders. So we make sure we have their perspective. Our board is very community development focused. We have a pretty strong community development network in the city of Cleveland. So we make sure we engage those folks, and they help us a lot in terms of engaging out in the neighborhoods as well, as we kind of do our data gathering.
Awesome. And I think, one of the things that I have actually noticed doing this work for the amount of time that I have, my apologies, is that there is a correlation between the number of people that are on your design team versus the number of people that can be expected to come out for those larger community summit events. And it also has to do with wholeness as well. If your design team is really interested in targeting, for example, members of minority communities, and we're not seeing minority communities represented on your design team, it's harder really to engage those groups. And that was one reason that I really wanted the three of you on this call, is because each of you really thought about your design teams very holistically. We at S&G, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is blending processes together. And so there are times when we will use appreciative inquiry as part of a design team effort, or open space technology as a way to do that. And those are the theories behind what really drives some of the activities that we're doing. Specifically looking at a question that we just got, how would we integrate appreciative inquiry into a design team? I think appreciative inquiry, when I tend to use it, and so I need to talk about it from my own perspective. Appreciative inquiry, when I tend to use it as a guide. It usually is not fully implemented, but it does align in the way that you are really using the process of appreciative inquiry to help define where you have been, and more importantly, what things look like from a very positive, ennobling perspective when you move forward. And so I have seen organizations use that particular model. For me, we tend to tap in more to open space when we're doing a lot of this work. And so I think back, for example, to some of the work that Jacob, you guys have done around equity and the mission of your organization, and thinking about biking and walking, and really creating kind of spaces for what should it look like, what would it look like if we were doing it very purposefully. Kind of tapping into those aspects of dream and discovery from appreciative inquiry to our viewer who asked that question. We just don't, at S&G, we tend not to follow just that process specifically. We'll design activities around it, but a lot of times it's really getting the organization and kind of meeting them where they're at, and what that looks like. one of the things that I think is really important is each of you used different series of activities that you went through. And so, for example, Elliot, I remember one of the activities that we actually went through with your organization at the design team level was crafting that strategic plan and using, I actually think we used preferred futuring to do that. But I'm wondering, and what I'm wondering is, if the three of you think back to work that we did with the design team, is there a particular activity that we did with your design teams that you felt was really helpful, or maybe even helped you as the executive directors gain insight into it? And I talked about yours, Elliot, because I know you weren't the executive director at the time.
Right.
So I didn't want to totally put you on the spot with that. But I'm wondering, Jacob and Dan, as you guys are thinking about your work that we've done with the design team, is there a particular activity that stood out for you that really was helpful to you to kind of get the group kind of lesson on where you left them to do?
Sorry, I had a little trouble understanding the end of the question there.
All right, Dan, is that any better? Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. There's some there, yeah.
It's a little buzzy. I'm going to try to work on that, folks. But really what I'm asking you guys is, as you think back about some of the activities that your design teams have done, Jacob, you guys did a whole series of activities this time around mission. I know, Dan, I think we did a whole series of activities around kind of where should your organization be prioritizing its programs. What was something, as you kind of look back, that you say, wow, that was a good experience, or that was a good conversation that our design team had that really helped us propel our work?
Yeah, I think for us, in our current strategic planning process, and you hit on this obviously, is we did a number of processes where we were talking about, where do we go with our mission? One of the exploratory questions we were having is, do we more wholly encompass, pedestrian issues or transit issues as part of our mission? And there was obviously a lot of opinions amongst our board members and folks on our design team about where that should go. So one of the the activities we did was to basically look at the mission and identify if we were to take on walking and transit, what should be added, what should be deleted, what should be changed. And I think that helped folks get a better understanding of, what does it mean for us to take on walking and take on transit if that's the route we're going to go. I think the other, I don't know if I would call it an activity, but just the separate discussions you have at tables with folks on your design team, and then bringing all of the input back together to hear all the different perspectives you get, and then kind of melding them into kind of consensus. I think that's one of the more valuable times I think we spend as our design team, is just having those conversations as individual groups, and then coming back together.
Yeah, I think a really important piece for us with the design team was really largely focused on the idea of sort of narrowing things down. We had gotten to a point where we just had so many things on our list that we wanted to do that, and it was impossible to do them all well with our given capacity. And so we were sort of thinking about that and thinking about how to categorize our work in a meaningful way. And the design team helped just sort of focus things a bit, because we had some of the, some similar questions to what Jacob was just saying around how broadly do we expand our work? And so the design team helped put some contours to it so that we could ask the right questions. We could figure out the questions that we wanted to ask of the broader community during the summit. The one that I mentioned earlier is a good one, is how much do we incorporate walking? There's a conversation about whether or not we shift our mission, change the wording of our mission to incorporate walking, which we didn't end up doing, but we did incorporate it in other places. And so it's sort of helping to define some of the key questions before we went to the large group in the summit.
Yeah, and I think for us, I mean, doing statewide work and having folks sort of spread out in such a large geographic area is such a big challenge. And so I think a lot of the initial exercises we did as a part of this process, not just with board members who, again, live in different places and some barely even know each other, or they've met, but they don't really know each other very well. But even with other stakeholders was, again, trying to get a consensus of kind of where we're at as a state in terms of bicycling, trying to figure out kind of, you know, really taking a temperature before we actually figured out what the next big steps were. So I liked a lot of what I thought the initial steps of trying to come to, again, not everyone's going to agree on everything, but trying to come to a general consensus on the temperature of the state, and kind of the progress that had been made. And again, folks were able to talk about their local challenges within that context, whether they live in South Georgia, along the coast, in the Atlanta area, you know, kind of in the middle of the state. And we had representation from different parts of the state, which I think helped that. And again, you know, there's not one right answer. Obviously, there's local challenges within local challenges even. So, but I think that was a big part of it because, again, you know, I was relatively new to the organization and hadn't lived in Georgia all that long on and off. So to hear what the challenges were from somebody along the coast or South Georgia is very different than what it's like in Athens in some ways. And obviously there's some commonality. So we were able to bring out some of that commonality while, again, I still think kind of hearing the differences and getting a real gauge of what was going on in the state.
Awesome. And I want to thank everybody for bearing with me as I had a mic issue there and had to get that fixed. So hopefully you guys can hear me better now. I think one of the things that I really find interesting is I listen to each of you talk about the different activities that you did. Each design team is always used to really dive into meet the organization where they are at. And so one of the things that we always talk about is our process meets the community where they are, meets the organization where they are. And I really think that the design team is a key to that piece because it gives us the ability to say, here's the questions that we anticipate. Just as you were talking about, Dan, with Bike Easy, you guys weren't even sure what the answer should be on walking and biking. Should it be both or what it should look like as a design team? And so the design team really made that decision. We're going to take that question to the community. Jacob, your design team really felt that as an organization, you wanted to be able to approach the community with this is where we think we should be heading. But you used your design team to explore some other growth questions. And those are conversations that are continuing to go on now. So I think it's kind of amazing how it really is the design team that helps you be able to tap into that process and make sure that you are comfortable, that you've got a strong unified team that can go to the community and say, this is what we're thinking, this is what we need to know from you, and this is where we want to go. So that was really, I couldn't have planned that discussion better. So I do want to check in before I check in with each of you on what we can expect next from your organization. Just curious if you have any thoughts on knowing what you know now. Is there something that you wish you would have done with your design team, just for others who are getting ready to go through this process? Is there a way that you feel you could have tapped in better to the knowledge of the design team?
I think for us, and it's actually, I think it's going to end up happening. You know, it wasn't originally written into our plan, but to develop kind of these little mini neighborhood gatherings to kind of expand our outreach into more Cleveland neighborhoods to folks that may not necessarily understand our work, but to kind of introduce them to Bike Cleveland and get their input on what they think we should be doing to make it easier for them to bike or walk. So that actually came out of our design team meetings when we started to plan for our larger summit. was, you know, how can we really ensure that we're talking to as many people as we can about our work and what we're going to do over the next 5 years. So the design team, you know, spoke out and said, you know, we really would love to see more of these kind of smaller neighborhood engagement activities going on. So, like I said, it's something we're going to be doing, but not something that was originally in our outreach plan for our larger strategic plan update.
And I think, Jacob, actually, that even talks directly to the power of the design team. Had we not had a design team doing that, and it was just maybe the staff, we might not have even went there with the conversation, right? And the need for doing it, or and not saying that the staff doesn't have that knowledge. It's that when you put more people in the room, you get more knowledge. And so you get those different perspectives. Dan or Elliot, any thoughts from you guys as you think about how you use the design team? What is something you wish you could have done?
Well, I really like Jacob and what Bike Cleveland are doing. So, you know, next time I go through it, I'm going to have to copy that. But one other thing that I think, again, you know, the process worked really well for us. The next time that we go through it, it was my first time, you know, being part of leading a design team to summit community engagement process around our strategic plan. But I do think that when I do it again, I might try to figure out, I don't know how to word this exactly, but that, you know, we're building buy-in the whole time through that whole process. And I think that potentially coming out of the design team process, having some folks that are a little bit more specifically assigned to the pieces of that they're most excited about and concerned with, and so that they can follow a particular part of, you know, so say it's how are we going to incorporate equity, or say it's how are we going to do better with our safety education, whatever the interest is, that people follow through the summit a bit more, they're a little more assigned. And then that, of course, is really to ensure that there's clear leadership for all of the various pieces moving beyond the summit. Because I think that we came up with a great plan, we're implementing a bunch of it, but, you know, there's some pieces of it are being implemented with more gusto than others. And I think that has a lot to do with, okay, where was their buy-in that stuck? And just thinking about how we might even be able to start that process sooner of creating real specific leadership for specific portions of the action plan.
There is an interesting thing between what Bike Cleveland is doing, Dan, and what you guys did, which was you guys had a really elevated time frame for your planning process. And I will say Bike Cleveland, I think, has an extra 3 months that they're putting into those. And so that almost makes me, from a process perspective, kind of think back and say, okay, next time, do I need to push for the extra time? And would that have been more effective for you guys? So but I love where you're going with that. Let's see, Elliot, anything from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think to use a sort of bike example, you know, part of what we've thought about relative to a statewide organization really is like a hub and spoke model, to a certain extent, where we're really a resource and our members are really local advocacy organizations, local programs, projects that have to do with bicycling, et cetera. So I think in some ways we could have designed it a little bit more to almost make kind of to focus specific sessions more regionally or locally, that might have been able to pull more folks in if we had focused sort of like, you know, had a couple different sort of locations that would have acted as almost like sort of mini hubs of activity or sort of sessions. It's a little easier, I think, sometimes to connect people locally to talk about something broader than it is just to try to pull all these different folks together to talk about something that's statewide. Because I'm thinking, you know, like Savannah, we could have pulled together a lot of folks, both from Savannah, but also the region on one call. Now, granted, that would have only given us a particular flavor within the state for that feedback. But I think it might have been a bit easier to engage. It would have been a bit more easier for folks to bite off kind of what they were trying to chew versus like trying to engage in this very broad statewide process, if that makes any sense. So, I mean, we're looking more towards how to sort of coordinate things regionally and sort of semi-locally anyway. So something like that might be helpful.
And ironically, by the way, it is very close to what Bike Cleveland is looking at doing with theirs, right? They're just doing it more of a local neighborhood level.
Right.
And so yours might be more of a local community level, and additional stuff that we can put in there. And I think that, you know, I've seen we've worked with 2 other organizations who have incorporated that additional outreach before the summit, and it really does transform their work. It's one that people are a little bit hesitant to do, and so I like it when it comes out on its own, like it did with Bike Cleveland. Our fear in pushing it is that it can sometimes seem a little bit overwhelming to organizations. But I think and Jacob, maybe we have you on in September or October and have you update us on how that process goes. I think might be a good way to do that. Okay, so I'm coming into my close here. If each of you can just give us 1 minute on what can we expect from your organization over the next 6 months. So what are some things that we should be looking for from Georgia Bikes over the next 6 months?
So in the next 6 months, I would say we're going to continue to do our annual bike summit. It's going to happen actually in Athens in October, and hopefully it'll be bigger and better than ever. And you know, engaging folks we haven't met with before, while also kind of bringing in folks we have. And I would say moving forward, you know, sort of deeper engagement with local organizations, particularly relative to the statewide work we do at the State House. Georgia has a very narrow window for the state legislature. It's like 40 days of legislating. So it's a really narrow window to get things done, to either get things positively done or to fight against things that aren't great. And we want to engage more with local advocacy organizations on these issues because state law has a pretty big impact what happens locally. And if we're not doing it, no one else is in terms of bicycling in the state. So deeper engagement there and hopefully more engagement at the local level with this kind of very important statewide work. So yeah, hopefully the next 6 months, that's something we're going to be more deeply engaged in.
Jacob, to you, 6 months, what should we expect from Bike Cleveland? What are some things we should keep our eye out for?
Yeah, I know, obviously, I think for all of us, summer is a busy time doing a lot of encouragement and events. So keep doing that, getting people out on bikes. We're also going to be doing a number of community rides where we're getting actually decision makers, local council members out on bikes in their neighborhoods with constituents so they can see and experience what it's like to be out on a bike in their ward. And then obviously the completion of our updated strategic plan and a large summit where we bring as many people together as we can to give input on our work over the next 5 years.
Awesome. Dan?
We got a lot going on, so I'll choose a few highlights here. Bike Easy is co-hosting the Walk Bike Places conference, used to be called Pro Walk, Pro Bike, Pro Place, here in New Orleans in September. And so a lot of work going into that, and specifically we're going to be doing a massive protected bike lane demonstration. So we're going to do a pop-up demonstration of a protected bike lane network downtown that's going to last for 3 months, so we can use it as a community engagement tool and a way to build momentum towards actually having a permanent protected bike lane that the city's looking to build out soon. We're also working with the city on developing a citywide bike plan, which we are lacking at the moment. We also really excited about our Teach the Teachers trainings that we're doing, and our education team is working to train PE teachers and other interested teachers in schools how to deliver bike walk safety education. So that's another really exciting piece. And then we have this fall, we are celebrating our 15th anniversary as an organization. So we're throwing our first ever Bike Easy Ball. It's going to be like a birthday party fundraiser and celebration of 15 years of making bicycling easy, safe, and fun for everyone in Greater New Orleans.
One thing that I love about New Orleans is we literally had to make sure that when we were scheduling things, we had to schedule around Mardi Gras, and I love that. It was such like normally it's you have to schedule around summer, and for you guys it was you have to schedule around our party. And I thought that was kind of neat and offered a different cultural perspective to it. I think each of you have those uniquenesses about your organization. So folks, we're getting ready to come to our close, and I have one more question for our panelists as you guys take us out. Before I go to that last question, I do want to ask for our viewers, if you've got takeaways that you're walking away from this conversation saying, wow, this is something that I'm taking away, I want to hear about that. So write that in the chat window. And if you do have additional questions, you are always welcome to leave those, and we will try to follow up on those and put those in our recap. You know, I've told each of you before that you guys working with S&G Endeavors in being able to talk about that experience with other people is actually probably the biggest driver of the work that we get from others. And it's really because going through the process and participating using design teams, as we've talked about today, or even the whole collaborative strategic planning process, you get exposure to what that can do for your organization. And so my last question to you guys is, can you help our viewers understand how how S&G Endeavors either helped your organization, or how you think we can be good at helping others who are trying to create plans within their community or within their organization to take their work to that next level? And I'll kind of let you guys weigh in as you want.
I think from my perspective, outside of just, you know, having a good process that you know, engages people on different levels, I think at least in our movement and the kind of the biking, walking, advocacy realm, it's kind of, you bring best practices that are happening across the country, because you do work with so many different groups similar to our own. You know, so bringing that perspective and getting a larger understanding of the national landscape, so we can ensure we're kind of learning from others and what others have done, be it good or be it bad.
Yeah, I'd totally echo that. I think it was part of what was so great about working with you, Jeremy, and with S&G was really the wide perspective. You know, both your experience, you know, the been at this for years, but then also in a variety of geographic areas. I think that's important. For me, you know, at the time I was still a pretty new executive director. There was a lot going on, and it was just so nice to have, you know, someone with the vision of like, here's how the process works. I mean, there were even times where I was like, I don't believe it. I don't see how it's going to work out that way. Right. But it was just like, you would help me through that and be like, no, this is, you know, and sure enough. And so I mean, I just think that, you know, bringing for our level of organization, no one had that expertise, let alone the time and energy to really apply it. And it was what we needed. We needed that someone to help us with the process to come up. We're very outcome driven in our organization. So we needed someone to be like, oh, let's think about the process and how we can make sure that that's bringing us to the outcomes that we really need. And I think that our strategic plan and the document and the actual action planning behind it were absolutely what we needed, and have compelled us to really great things now. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll agree with Dan. Oh, yeah, there we go. I'll agree with Dan in that, you know, I think our organization, with sort of one staff person for a long time, a board that's sort of in different places, you know, I think process was a challenge. And I think what y'all brought in terms of organizing process and really, you know, helping us set up a framework to, for lack of a better term, like herd cats, you know, that helping set up that framework where I think in the past, it's a challenge to do that as an organization in such a large state, which is like a broken record now, but it is the biggest challenge, I think, in what we do. Maybe the second part of it is helping us find commonality in such a again, diverse state geographically. We had folks from small towns to bigger cities like Atlanta, obviously the biggest city in Georgia, sort of on these calls and being able to find kind of a commonality when in reality there's such differences in terms of communities, I think was a big plus. Because when we go to the state capitol or when we're meeting with GDOT, they don't necessarily want to hear that bicyclists in different part of the state have different needs. They want to hear those needs, and we need to have a nuanced take on how we can represent all those needs. And I feel like the process that y'all led us through in terms of the strategic plan really helped me, at least as a participant, not ED at that point, but as a participant, sort of think about that moving forward. Because again, to me, it's whether you're in Atlanta or whether you're along the coast or wherever you are, you're a bicyclist in Georgia, and ultimately that's who I feel responsible to. So I feel like that kind of dynamic of bringing folks together and finding that commonality was probably the biggest plus.
Yeah. And I'll add one more thing here, actually, is that, I think that along with just the strategic plan that pointed us to be like, here's what we need to do, the process through which we developed it has affected how we're actually implementing our strategic plan. So for instance, I mentioned that, big pop-up bike network that we're doing. Well, we would kind of approach that through a design team, not exactly the same, but like through a design team process where we started with a small group to kind of get some main inputs and figure out the questions that need to be answered, take that to a larger group. And then again, when it comes time to build the thing, like we will have a lot of people invested and bring in lots of different networks. And so it has continued to, I think that's a real testament to the power of this process, and what we learned working with S&G is that we have adapted it and continued to use it in our everyday work as we move forward.
Try this. Is that better?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Hello? Okay. So sorry about that. What I was going to say is that working with all of you is actually what I think really is the best demonstration of our process. And hearing you guys talk about how it has impacted your work and how it's allowed you to take things to the next level, I think is really amazing. So thank you so much for sharing with our audience today. For folks who have been watching or will watch afterwards, just remember that in July, we'll do another episode of S&G Connections. We haven't set the date for that, but it will be toward the end of the month, and we'll be actually kind of building off of our design team piece to talk about the entire process that we use here at S&G Endeavors called Engaged Change. And really we'll talk more about the summit piece, or the, we call them accelerator events that really help you bring on a vast array of stakeholders and directly and meaningfully engage them in your planning. So we've been hearing about Bike Cleveland and Georgia, and Georgia Bikes and Bike Easy, and how each of you culminated your planning in a summit stage. And we'll dig more into that and what that looks like in July. So please stay tuned to our website, sgendeavors.com, where you can get all information relating to S&G Connections, our Facebook feed, and our LinkedIn feed. We do tend to announce most of our stuff on there. And also, be sure to check out our blog. We've got a new story that hasn't even hit social media yet that will be going out tomorrow, talking about Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, and more specifically how Public Health Solutions, one of their local health departments, has been kind of taking the same or a similar process that these three organizations used, but applying it in local small communities, and how those processes have worked and been customized to meet those community needs. So check out the blog on sgendeavors.com. A big thanks to Bike Easy and to Georgia Bikes and to Bike Cleveland for allowing us to be part of your success, and for coming online today and to talk about that with our viewers. I can't appreciate that enough. And this concludes today's episode. So thanks again to everybody for being on. Thank you to John and Jerry on our staff for helping make these episodes successful. And as always, if you have questions, contact me, Jeremy, at sgendeavors.com. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Oh.